Hi, I'd like to welcome people, and we're talking today with Professor Jayne Docherty, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. And we've known Jayne for a long time and been very impressed with the work that she does between what we would call deeply divided, highly intractable groups and people in conflict. And she has a very balanced and, we think, insightful view of people on both sides of the red-blue divide in the United States. We saw her give a talk about her work in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where she lives, which she pointed out is very much like a microcosm of the United States. The city is liberal, the county is conservative, and you put it together and you see the kinds of conflicts arising that we're seeing all over the country. And the story that she told earlier about her work with militias in Harrisonburg was fascinating, so we asked her to come talk to us at BI and tell the story again and tell us what has been happening since the 2020 election, because I would assume things have gotten hotter. So, Jayne, why don't you give us the background to your work and tell us what's going on now?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate the time. I would say to say I've been doing a lot of work on this is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. I am working with a lot of other people, but also just mostly at this point, it's very exploratory. It's not like we've convened any big conversations. I've had personal conversations with people, and I'll talk about that because I think all good work in this area has to start with good analysis and relationship building, which takes time. So, can't just kind of all of a sudden have a crisis and then dive in and say, hi, I'm here to help and I have a process if you don't have relationships with people. And so I'd like to go ahead and share that and talk about what is going on in our area. So I do have this PowerPoint from the last time we were together, which was actually in December. So before January 6th, but after the election. So what do you do when the militia are your neighbors and your community is really a microcosm of the country? That was the question I started with. And I'll just go ahead and share kind of what I talked about back then. I wanted to first talk about why I call Harrisonburg and Rockingham County, Virginia, which are in the gorgeous Shenandoah Valley, a microcosm of the U.S., and then what some recent critical events have been, the election results and the responses to the results, and then what I think we could or should be doing. So here we are in the western part of the state, and you can see our election results. So 70% of the county went for Trump and 65% of the city went for Biden. And it has been that way for quite some time. The city flipped fully blue in 2008 and has never gone back. And so we're now, and the city itself is extremely multicultural. We are a refugee resettlement community. And so in addition to 2 universities and businesses related to the universities and the refugee resettlement communities and immigrant communities, working largely in the poultry industry, which I'll talk about in a minute, it's basically become this very multicultural, fascinating city, lots of really cool restaurants and different cultures, 60-some languages spoken in the public schools. Our schools in the city have become models that people come study for how to do English language learning. We have a school that people come to look at that's, dual immersion, Spanish, English, and parents fight to get their children into that school. So no Republican has won a city race since 2008. And then there's Rockingham County, which has lots of open space, little towns dotted around, and lots of poultry farming and beef and some dairy. The county is predominantly white and has lots of from heres as opposed to all the come heres who live in the city. And it's organized around agriculture. And I wrote, almost no Democrat can win a county race. There are some long-standing, long-term family residents who have won. They've been there for generations, and they are Democrats, and they have won like a school board race or things like that. I think the from here-ness outweighs they're a Democrat, or it has in the past. What do these areas share? They are largely probably the biggest economic sector is the agricultural economy. Rockingham County makes, it takes 5 more counties in the state of Virginia to make as much money on agriculture as Rockingham County makes. It's phenomenally rich in terms of its soil and the microclimate that is created by the mountains on either side of the valley. This county in particular is incredible for growing crops and feeding animals and doing all of the stuff. And then the poultry processing, and then all of the support services for agriculture, right? So all of those things also provide a strong economy. However, there's a lot of poverty and inequality. And I don't know if you've heard of the United Way ALICE studies, asset limited, income constrained, employed. It's a new category that United Way is trying to track and categorize because the poverty level hasn't been changed. The measuring of poverty hasn't been changed. And these are the people who are like one bad tire on their car away from catastrophe, with no assets and limited ability to access anything for an emergency, or one emergency room visit away from disaster. And they did adjust the study in the city to try to eliminate all of the students who are at James Madison University largely, and then our little tiny university on the other side of town, by dropping anyone under the age of 25 out of the city study. And they still came up with a 61% ALICE or below levels of poverty. It had a huge effect during COVID. We were a COVID hotspot for quite some time. People are living in crowded conditions, can't isolate when they got sick. So we really saw it this year, the impact of this kind of inequality. Then there are a lot of other issues that actually are shared in the city and the county. The county has serious broadband access issues. Again, COVID highlighted that. Students not able to access schools. I mean, because of the mountains, you get back in the hollers, and there's really not even good cell service in some places, let alone access to this. And it's not profitable for the companies. And Virginia, frankly, Republican legislators for a long time blocked any of the expanding along with the electric cooperatives, you know, like allowing the municipality or the electric cooperative to put in the broadband access, because they kept passing legislation to favor Comcast or all the big companies who won't do it because it's no profit, right? So housing quality is a problem, and the affordability of housing is a huge problem. Right now in the city, you can't even, I mean, houses aren't even staying on the market for 3 or 4 days, right? I mean, they're gone, and especially in the affordable range. And part of it they've discovered through a big housing study is that I think it might be partially the thrifty Mennonite culture. Those of us who can afford the McMansions are not moving up into them. And then there's the squeeze on the houses that would be for more affordable, right? Like, so we're just not vacating them. We're not following the pattern. Drugs, serious problem with drugs. The county in particular people talk about the challenge of drugs, and then lack of mental health services, problem in both areas. And then what do we look like on the state and national in terms of electing leaders? Basically, this area has been gerrymandered so substantially that we probably should have a Democrat as a state delegate, but we don't because they chopped a couple of cities apart. And the state senators in the Valley are all Republicans. And our congressional representative is a Republican, and one of the ones who's still saying that the election was stolen. But our senators, state senators, are all Democrats, both Democrats, and the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general, Democrats. And in 2019, Democrats took control of the state legislature. So we're becoming more and more an isolated pocket of Republican representation, which I think with a little ungerrymandering, this area might also be, it could go either way. Any questions that you want me to clarify so far? Okay. Yeah. So the differences and tensions between the areas, immigration enforcement, you can imagine we might have differences of opinion over Second Amendment issues, Black Lives Matter, and the militia presence. So here's what happened, and it's not a very big picture and you can't really see it, but when Trump's travel ban went in 2017, within 24 hours, and you are not seeing anywhere near this whole picture of who was there, about 1,000 people or 1,500 people showed up on Court Square in the city to say, no, this is not okay. We were the 9th most affected city by the travel ban because our refugee population came from the countries that were specifically targeted in the ban. So these were our neighbors. We had neighbors who were stuck, unable to get back into the country after having gone home for a visit. So this was our community. And I just wanted to show you the sign. I don't know if you've seen the tri-colored signs. They kind of have gone all over the country. I even saw some in Canada where it says, it doesn't matter where you're from, you're welcome here, in 3 different languages. Those actually were created in our town. And they have spread everywhere, but they were created in Harrisonburg well before the travel ban. So even before this, we were actively saying we welcome people. And they were actually created by a graduate of our program.
Were they created because there was pushback earlier before the travel ban, or?
They were created around the time of Trump's election. So kind of even before he had a chance to do that, but when he started running for office and there was all the stuff around, even in the campaign, build a wall and all of that. So we as a community in the city, very quickly reacted to what looked like a significant threat to our community and our neighbors. We've been a refugee resettlement community for more than 40 years. So we're talking multi-generational, long-standing families in our area, right? So there was a movement to end cooperation with ICE that predates Trump. So this would have been back in 2014 or 15. The city, a coalition formed to say, we don't want you cooperating with ICE. And it had to do with some incidents where long-term residents with no history of criminal activity or anything were picked up by ICE. And so there were a couple of cases that really hit the paper and hit the community hard. And so the city kind of mobilized to say, we don't want that. And the Rockingham County had to get involved and agree to end the 287G agreement, which is where if you're a local law enforcement and you arrest somebody, then you check their records with ICE, and then they can be held locally without trial until ICE comes and picks them up. So we had to get the county involved in this because The sheriff's office, which while it remains mostly white, runs the jail. So the city law enforcement has become much more diverse. At the time I put this together, we had an African-American police chief. We were so excited. He had joined us from Richmond. And then he got a job offer to go back closer to Richmond, which is his home, and be a chief of a much bigger locality. And he left, but the next person was, the acting chief was Latino. And there's been this change in the policing in the city, where I've actually heard a police officer who's white say something about, I mean, I think the quote was, if we show up and we don't understand the people, that's on us, not on them, right? Like, we need to have the language diversity and the capacity to work with the residents of our community. The sheriff's office, on the other hand, remains mostly white, has a different reputation for working with the community and the diversity of the community. And so there's some tension there. One thing I think that happens is the sheriff's office, the deputies who are a little more progressive, they move into the city and join the city police force. And then in 2018, I woke up, there was a text on my phone at 5 a.m. and I'm looking at this thing and it's a property record, transfer of property of a house that had been for sale up right above Eastern Mennonite University in this little Mennonite neighborhood. And look who moved in. These are the people who run Red Ice Media, which is a major white nationalist, white supremacist media operation that has global reach. And they bought this house kind of in the middle of this Mennonite community. And then they were shocked when we indicated we knew who they were and that they were there. I'm like, well, you didn't do your homework very well. You can't move into a Mennonite community that's, you know, pretty closed and not have everybody go figure out who you are, because they'll do their research. They ended up leaving in January of 2021, just packed up and left. They were cut off of YouTube, you know, kind of in the purges of the media platforms, they got cut off. But the response in Harrisonburg was, you know, what are we going to do? Who are these people? And keeping in mind, this is a year after Charlottesville, Virginia, which is an hour away, right? They're like, they're here to stir things up. They're here to, so we did a lot of investigation and concluded that they basically, their role in the movement of white supremacy is they see themselves as some sort of intelligentsia who set the framework of philosophy more than they just actively rile people up. So they're very, very prominent in expanding the white replacement theory, and, you know, that whites are going to be replaced, and that their white culture is in danger, and they really run those kinds of programs. And we concluded that the people who are actually most at risk from them were not our neighbors who are not white, right? But rather the students at the various universities, especially because they seem to be wanting to target people who are going to be teachers or health professionals or people who are moving into places where they want them to have this white replacement theory in. And so all of the universities in our area run teacher education programs. And we're like, oh, these are the people we need to be worried about getting caught up in this. We did a few things around the campuses to say, let's keep an eye on what kinds of papers students are writing, what kinds of sources they're citing. Is this coming into there? And then we mostly ignored them. And then they went away.
So there weren't any incidents?
No. So we had this long strategy conversation because you can imagine people wanted to go up. They lived on the top of this gorgeous hill that has a west view and an east view, and I mean, it's a $500,000 house. It was like a huge which I know doesn't sound like much in some parts of the country, but in Harrisonburg, Virginia, that's a beautiful house. And, you know, it's a dead end street and people are like, we should go protest. Like, oh, that would work great. They would take those tricolored signs and do a whole riff on how everybody but white people who are proud of being white are welcome in Harrisonburg, right? Like, you welcome everybody but us. So in the end, people concluded the best strategy was just to treat them with civility and ignore them. And I don't know if that was the right choice or not. And then also to work with, you know, hoping that they would be deplatformed out of YouTube and places like that, which they were. And so we decided not to confront them directly, but to keep an eye on what they were doing. Of course, as soon as the state legislature and the governorship and the attorney general and the lieutenant governor were all Democrats, guess what became an issue? So we have off-year elections. So that was 2019 election that we flipped blue. And then in 2020, here we are. And there's a big movement. So ironic because there was all of this backlash in the county about anybody suggesting we be a sanctuary city for refugees or immigrants, right? Like big uproar. And it isn't even something there was conversation in the city about, do we declare ourselves a sanctuary city? But it wasn't anything that became a big thing because there wasn't a big push for it. And we were, mostly we're like, we feel like we can take care of our people. We don't have to make a big statement. So then became the sanctuary county movement, Second Amendment sanctuary. So making it illegal to enforce any state or federal law against guns in your county. And quite a few counties in Virginia passed this. And Rockingham County, this is the high school. They moved the county supervisors meeting to the high school because they knew they would have a big crowd coming. And this is a shot of it. It was a couple thousand people showed up, and they eventually had to shut the meeting down because anyone who tried to speak against sanctuary county status could hardly be heard. And I had a couple of friends who went to speak against this, who, as it was all breaking up and shutting down, a couple of people who were there to support the Sanctuary County initiative came up to them and said, we do not agree with the tone in this place and we will walk you to your car. And so it got to that level where people really felt like this felt very threatening and intimidating. But within the people who were there to advocate for Second Amendment, there were also people who said this is not okay, right? Because we believe in the First Amendment as well as the Second Amendment. They self-identified as veterans and said, we will walk you to your car. And I know that happened for a couple of people who were there. In the city, we avoided the whole conversation through a swift maneuver of the agenda of the city council that led to it being a discussion, but there would be no vote on it. And so it was sort of a process, little switcheroo that didn't give it the kind of hearing, and very few people showed up to support it. So that's all on everybody's mind. And then George Floyd is murdered. And then Black Lives Matter. We had a big Black Lives Matter rally in the city, which everybody would expect. But what I think people didn't anticipate was two small towns out in the county where the high school students, remember the younger generation is a little bit more diverse, and they're in high school with more diverse young people than their parents are used to, sponsored Black Lives Matter rallies to talk about problems with racism and stuff that was going in the schools in these two small towns. So in Elkton and in Broadway. And they were met by militia and counter protesters. And then there was a lot of question about whether those militias were cooperating with the police and vice versa. So were they coordinating? I know from some personal conversations that in fact the city and town officials in both places were not, I don't think, at least in one town, were concerned about safety and were as concerned about the militias as they were and counter protesters as they were about anybody else, right? Maybe even more so. But after this, there was kind of an investigation. So there was some local reporting done that said, did the militias and the law enforcement, so these would be small town police. So each of these towns has their own very small police department. And then there would be the sheriff's office. Did they cooperate together in their activities around these two Black Lives Matter rallies? And there's no paper trail evidence, but my sense is these guys all know each other, right? If they're the local militia, they went to high school with the cops, right? They all know each other, so they are going to talk to each other out in public. They're not going to just say, I can't talk to you. So there's this whole different set of relationships that gets a little harder to sort out.
Was there any violence?
Was there any what? No violence. No. I mean, there was some shouting. This guy, there were some really ugly pictures of people shouting and screaming at the students. There were also some groups here who kind of deployed out people to stand between and promote nonviolence. So a number of people from the city who were trained, some of them have Christian peacemaker team experience, were out there. And their reports back were that it's a little more complicated than you think on the militias. And I was like, I'm not surprised by that, because I have a little theory about what's happening with militias in this country right now. That, we've had the longstanding militia movements, which are largely local, and then that there are other pressures on them right now, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that it wouldn't all have been local people. And what I was hearing is people were coming from other counties, but they were also coming a little bit from further away, and those were the people that people were most worried about. The people with no local connections, right? Kind of no social capital, no constraints, and that even within the militia, there was tension over the non-local people, and that there were different motives of people who showed up under the banner of militia. So I was hearing some reports and hearing that, and then they did a series of reports on our local NPR station, which does some very good local reporting, and then on a local online newspaper. And one of the last lines in the last article was the head of the Rockingham County Militia saying, I wish people would just talk to us. Just ask us, call us, right? So I took that seriously. And I know the reporter, and I backtracked and I said, can you get a message to this person? And they said yes. So I ended up having a meeting with them. The meeting didn't take place until after the election. So let's talk about what was going on in the meantime. So approaching the election in 2020, there was fear based on this experience with the militias on Black Lives Matter rallies. People in the city and people in the county who were Democrats and who were concerned about potential violence, or intimidation at the polls. We have some polling precincts in Harrisonburg that are majority minority, right? The population that lives there is majority minority, and there was some fear that those polling places might be subject to intimidation or problems. There was also, of course, a lot of early voting happening, right? So people were doing what everybody around the country was doing, which is voting early because of the pandemic. And it was very clear in the reports out from the officials that it was Democrats who were voting early, just like happened across, there was a lot of heavy voting early in the city, less in the county. So the Democratic committees, both city and county, reached out to the Republican committees to say, can we get a handle on this? Can we talk about what this will look like? And the Republican committees just said, don't worry about it, not interested, no conversation. So the Democratic committees were thinking, how do we protect voters? How do we make sure there's no intimidation? And then there were just general citizens who joined the Hold the Line group, which was part of all of that national organizing that was happening. And we formed a local chapter of Hold the Line and started preparing for how could we ensure safety on the day of the election. The electoral board members and registrars, both Democrat and Republican, were just doing their jobs, being extraordinarily professional, just like we saw in most parts of the country. You know, it was, for them, it was all about the process. The early voting was going on. Election day, we had no problems, no visible guns. We're a concealed carry state, so I don't know how many people. You never know around here. And no militia presence that we were aware of or could see. There had been back channel conversations with the sheriff's office and the police department. What are we doing to protect polling places? How are you handling this? Conversations with the Commonwealth's attorney. Are you going to send out a message? In Charlottesville, they sent out a joint message saying there will be no tolerance at all for any guns at polling places, period. Here, they chose not to send that out. They told us, we've communicated as we feel like we need to, and we think that any public communication is just going to provoke something. So, which I read to say, they all called their high school buddies and said, don't show up with guns, and, you know, it will be okay. And we had to trust them. I was at a city polling place for the whole day. There was a police car that parked way far away in the parking lot a couple of times during the day and stayed there for a while. That was it. And we didn't hear anything out in the county. And I actually heard the sheriff say, you know, us being there can also be a problem of intimidation. And we recognize that too, right? Some people may feel intimidated by our presence there. So whatever they did was pretty low key. The precinct work that day felt like, it really felt like the good old days. I don't know if you do precinct work on an election day, but generally for decades, everywhere I've lived, it's been, I'm on one side and some person who lives in my community that I see once a year when we're at the polling location handing out literature is over here. And that's how it was. And people were courteous, right? They had printed their sample ballots on blue paper. Generally, we try to have an agreement that we use the blue paper and they use something else. But, you know, I would just jokingly say, so do you want the real blue sample ballot or do you want theirs? And we would, you know, kind of talk back and forth. But I was overhearing some of their conversation with each other and realizing we have a problem. For one thing, the polling and the incoming people were clearly more Republican than they were Democrat because the Democrats had voted early. And so here they are watching this and they're going, oh yeah, we got this, right? And you could hear them talking about there isn't going to be a problem. It's going to be a clear victory and there's no way Biden can win. And you can see why their perceptions are this election was stolen, right? If all they saw was that, then they don't know how this happened. Then there were the tensions while awaiting results. The Hold the Line group went out on the street saying, you need to count all the ballots, back when Trump was trying to shut the counting down. And then when he said, no, count all the ballots, we got off the streets. But there was just this general tension, and our local elected representatives, obviously the Democrats were fine, but our Republican, especially our congressman, he was one of the ones that voted to overturn the results in another state. He signed on to the lawsuit. He has voted against the inquiry into January 6th, and he's really flipped into being a Trump kind of person. So everywhere I turn in the peace building community, people have been working overseas. It's like, what do? We have all these skill sets for violent places. And the first thing people talk about is dialogue. And I'm like, what? Dialogue is how liberals get what they want. That's how conservatives in this country feel about dialogue. It's true in the churches. So the thing that I think a lot of maybe urban liberal folks don't recognize is that many of the people who are on the more conservative side here have had experiences in their churches in the last decade or so around same-sex marriage, around ordaining women, around this, where somebody comes in and tries to do dialogue, and that's how liberals get what they want in the church, right? So because so many of the people in our work maybe don't go to church or in, they're UU or they're in liberal churches, they don't recognize that this whole idea of dialogue is already tainted by other life experience that their neighbors have had or have felt. So to just come in and say, let's do dialogue, plus dialogue in the absence of some kind of worldview détente is just dialogue of the deaf. How are we going to talk about something if we don't even agree about the reality? And something else needs to happen. And then honestly, the Republican leaders have really stepped up in our area using paranoia and fear, right? They're just fueling it. And then quite honestly, and I want to say this, I have heard some of the most hateful things from my liberal colleagues in terms of the way they talk about rural people and rural Republicans and rural communities. It's frankly appalling, right? And it's ignorant. I'll talk about that in a minute. To me, it's like I've put up some diagrams. We need substantive structural peace building in this country and not dialogue, right? Dialogue needs to be part of it, but there are many other factors that are driving us apart than just a different perspective that we can overcome by sharing ideas. There are real things that have happened in rural America that have deeply damaged community fabric, hope, opportunity, right? Even within our county, there are towns that have been devastated by their inability to stay connected, never mind to broadband, to stay connected to the poultry economy because their roads are so bad that they've ended up, their kids all have to move out to find work, leaving behind old people and falling down chicken houses. There are people in our county who live without connection to sewer and public running water and with a straight pipe running to the river because they cannot afford the $30,000 that it would take to dig into the rock and put in a septic system. There's deep divides and real harm that's been done to rural America in the last 40 or 50 years that has to be taken into account. And it's very invisible because people are proud. And I lived out in the county for a while, and I had neighbors who during hunting season, that's when they filled their freezer with meat. And that's how they managed, even though they're quite poor. They had gardens and they feed themselves and they're very independent. So I think a community like ours is kind of like the front line of this so-called civil war, right? We actually have all of these dynamics and we're small enough you can get your arms around it and we can talk to each other. So my thing is we start building from the ground up. We start with what are some shared problems that we share across city and county. Could be broadband, could be flooding. Both locations have some flood areas that are prone to flooding. We identify the structural drivers and begin addressing those together and set aside trying to have the left-right political conversation. And then also hold political leaders on both sides to account for driving this division on purpose. And there are some people in the area that are working on this. So Faith in Action is a coalition of faith communities that crosses the city-county line that is trying to ramp up. They've done a lot of work on criminal justice reform, and they've done, so every year they pick a topic and they push for some kind of change. And they've recently signed on with Industrial Areas Foundation to kind of do a power up drive where they're really trying to build local people power to address local issues and these kinds of problems. So I've been spending some time with them because I think they have the right idea. And then I also, as I said, I did reach out to the militia and we ended up meeting on November 7th. So after the election. What I found really interesting was how so many of my liberal friends responded to my telling them that I was going to meet with the command team of the local militia. So this is the middle of the pandemic. And, you know, I'm like, haven't been out or seen people or been out of my little bubble, but I agreed to meet them at a local Irish pub kind of restaurant. And people are like, are you going to be safe? Like, well, what are they going to do to me at the Irish pub? I mean, I'm assuming we're in public, it's going to be fine. And what I discovered from talking with them, my hypothesis is right. The traditional militia groups, which are very local, are being fractured in two different ways. They're being fractured a little bit internally by the people who've made the Second Amendment the sole kind of thing that they care about. And then they're being fractured by people who are coming from the outside, who are trying to drive white supremacist thinking into what was a local group. The local group, by the time I met with them, had changed their name from Rockingham County Militia to Rockingham County Volunteer Emergency Response Team. So I was like, the militia brand isn't working anymore. And they sort of ignored that, but that's really what I think it is, right? And then they talked about the role that their concerns too about election violence earlier in the week, and that they had basically had some conversations, I think, with some of the people who were all about guns to say, you know, if you really think you're making people feel safe when you do that, you're not. So I don't know how much of that went on, and I don't know how much they were responsible for the fact that there weren't a lot of guns or militia types hanging around polling places. We didn't get deep into it, but there's definitely a conversation that's happening in those groups about how much you focus on the Second Amendment and how much you focus on community safety and what your militia mission was when you formed. And as for white supremacist stuff, they said our group has a zero tolerance policy around any kind of racist behavior, symbols, activities, any of that. So I think that there are some implications here as we think about what to do going forward. And remember, the first time I presented this was before January 6th. It was between the election and January 6th. I think that some of the implications are that some of these traditional militia groups and Second Amendment activists tend to be our neighbors, and they may be key in our communities for fending off white supremacist activists and recruiters who are coming in to try and mobilize, right? So we should look for that. And it's possible that these folks can be worked with around local problems. So when we finished kind of chatting about that, I said, what are the problems out in the county? What do you all care about? What are the big challenges? How are the farmers doing in the middle of this pandemic? And we just had a conversation, and they said, our kids are getting into drugs. We need drug rehab. We need things for kids to do. We need mental health services, serious mental health problems. And I don't know if people are aware of this generally, that the suicide rates in rural communities among white male farmers is astronomical. I don't think that we have had the same problem because our farming community is so successful here, but across America, that is a problem in many communities. And they said, you know, we need opportunities. We need broadband. We need all of these things. We had a lot to talk about that was very common, right? And so I started saying, well, how do we identify shared problems across the city-county line? Obviously, financial vulnerability, shared problem. It's in the city, it's in the county. Access to broadband, the criminal justice system, huge problem. There's an attempt to expand the regional jail. So I met with the militia group again in March. And I said, are you all aware that they're trying to expand the Middle River jail, which is the regional jail? And they're like, what are they doing that for? We need drug rehab, we need addiction services, and we need, and they don't happen in the jail, and we need mental health support systems. And I said, well, you know, there's a whole group that's organizing to oppose this expansion. You want me to put you in touch with them? And so I did an introductory email and to the group that was organizing and these guys, and they never wrote back on the email, but I think they joined the Facebook group, some of them. But they were really clear. I mean, some of them had worked at the jail, right? And they're like, we don't need to expand that place. There's all kinds of problems with that. So, I mean, it was like instant, kind of, that is not what we need. And they just weren't aware of the organizing that was going on in the liberal city, right?
The story is that all of their concerns are they sound like liberal concerns.
Yes.
So the opportunities for joint effort are enormous.
Yes.
So that brings me back to something you talked about before, which is, what's it mean to them to be a militia member? What's the purpose of a militia?
Community service and an emergency response. So
sort of like Lions Club or Elks Club or something like that?
Yes, but with an emphasis on, we could also shoot people if you needed us to, right? Like we could, so there's a bit of a paramilitary focus on this, but it's also a little bit law enforcement. Some of them have a law enforcement background. Several of them were veterans, and younger ones, people who, not old people who've been in the global war on terror, right? They've been to Afghanistan and Iraq. We had some conversations about that. I think it's about serving your community.
Now, years ago, we were involved in mountain search and rescue all over Colorado. And we'd go into rural communities and there'd be posses. There would basically be a bunch of civilians that would help out the sheriff on occasion.
Yep.
And that they would, they had less mountaineering skills than we did, but we would search together for lost people.
Right.
They would do, they'd organize food for everybody and all sorts.
These guys run a major food bank. These guys actually, not a permanent food bank, but they've done food drives. They step in when somebody in the community needs health. They need, money raised for health care. That's what they do, right? And so in between, I'm trying to remember when that was. It was early on a Saturday morning. I had just gotten out of bed, and my townhouse is up on a hill. So, we're in this valley and it's hilly and stuff. And there was an explosion that rocked my house. And I was like, oh my God, what was that? And I run over to the bathroom window and I look out, and there's this big giant plume of smoke coming up over near the highway. And I'm like, oh, did a tanker truck turn over? Did a whatever? Turned out it wasn't a gas explosion in a small strip mall shipping, and it blew the place apart and also did serious damage in the area. They responded immediately and went to help with a variety of things like crowd control and to let fire and rescue do what they needed, to set up a food tent, to do things like that. But I said to them, what was your first thought? And I said, because my first thought was, who's running a meth lab in the city, right? Like, what was that? My second thought was it was a tanker truck. And then I didn't know what it was, right? But they were all like, oh yeah. We were like, who's running a meth lab in the city? We know they're out in the county, but wow. And then I think another issue that we all can get around would be big poultry industry. So the interesting thing about this county is this is really where big poultry started. Like, there were two families here, the Wamplers and oh my gosh, I've just lost the other name. Anyway, they created this whole how to raise poultry and get it to communities. This was in the 20s and 30s. And it was a way to take rural farmers and help them become self-sustaining and not just hard-scrabble farmers, right? Now, increasingly over all these decades, it's become major vertically integrated poultry operations where the farmers are now back to basically being sharecroppers with a lot of debt for a lot of heavy equipment, right? And it's had turmoil. So the other thing that's happened is, I had the date in my head, but it was like in 2005 or 6, Pilgrim's Pride just announced that they were going to close all of one whole operation at one end of the county in 60 days. And that was 160 some farmers who were SOL for their livelihoods. And people were like, what? So they formed a cooperative, and it's now the Virginia Poultry Growers Cooperatives. Tim Kaine, I think he might have been the governor then, stepped in and helped them find financing. And they have now become an alternative approach to farming here. And they've moved more towards organic and sustainable because they don't have all the pressure. And they run multiple processing plants. Then there was this whole thing where these large operations, they'll just abandon a facility that's out of date. They'll just walk away from it. And there were a number of those sitting around. And then some older farmers were like, I'm not putting another $60,000 into my operation at this stage in my life. I can't take on that debt. And they formed what is now Farmer Focus and is organics, was Shenandoah Valley Organics. They took over the old operating systems and they've created. So we're seeing this reshaping of the poultry economy that nobody's paying attention to, but it's creating resilience. And then there's all of these younger people who are homesteading smaller farms and really going really organic and really in a different way with farming. All of that stuff's happening out in the county, and very few people in urban areas actually recognize what's happening as opportunity, right? And then I think the other thing we have to do is begin diving in very locally to the mostly hidden histories. So very few people realize the Shenandoah Valley was burned to the ground during the Civil War. It was also the site of a lot of war resistance because the Mennonites and Brethren would not participate in the war. But the Northern Army came through here and burned this place to the ground because it was the breadbasket feeding the South. And there's a huge scar on the psyche that has come down the generations for ways that people approach conflict and how they feel about that. We need to tell those stories and look at them. After the war, this was the home, our county was one of the local organizing sites for the readjuster movement. You know, we didn't go straight from the end of the Civil War to Jim Crow. It actually took a long time to hammer the Jim Crow system into place. And in some places, like Wilmington, North Carolina, there was an elected, biracial government that was overthrown by a coup. Here in Virginia, we had what were called the readjuster movement, where freed slaves and white upcountry farmers got together and told Richmond, we want schools, we want roads, we're not paying taxes just to pay off your war debt. And they got elected, and they were elected at the state, they were elected into the federal, into Congress. And it took decades to hammer them out. And there is a trail of progressive thinking and pockets of progressive thinking in the county that goes back to this period. And it's one of the reasons Harrisonburg has such good schools and has we have our own water. We do our own water supply, and it's been really well developed, and our own electric company. So I talked about the innovation and resilience in farming. And then I think the other shared history that we have is we could all get together and tell stories about being pushed off of our land by big operators who wanted us gone. So we have refugees, the Shenandoah National Park to the east of us. All the people who lived up in that parkland were pushed off to build the park, and were relocated down into our area. Big multi-generational trauma scars, and yeah. And then in the city, they used HUD money to basically dismantle and take apart the African-American community. So many, many truth tellings could be done about being pushed off the land. And then when I asked the militia guys I met with, how long have your families been here? And some of them go back to the 1700s, like first settler families. Some are more recent. And a lot of them came from places where they were being pushed off the land. The Scottish land clearances or Irish being pushed out. And so I think even if we just sat and told all of our stories about how our families were forcibly relocated, and then there's been the whole thing in the Monacan Nation, which is the Native American tribal group for this area. It was mostly a hunting ground, and so it was shared by many different tribes, but they are revitalizing, and Virginia recognized, but federal tribal recognition was finally given to the Virginia tribes after a 20-year-long fight in recent years. Many conversations could be had. So, and that's my story.
Very interesting. So is anything coming of your conversations with the militia groups, or is that pretty much?
Yeah, I touched base with them. I touched base with them the second time to show them this and to say, this is what I shared. And they're like, okay. I think that's a longer process, right? So I connected them in with the jail thing. I'll probably reach out to them after I get through teaching here and I'm a little less busy. I'll reach out again and say, I've also been working with the Faith in Action and the Industrial Areas Foundation, trying to, that movement to power up and say, how do we connect people? And then I think we should pick one of these things and try to work on it, right? Whether we say, and part of that will be where are the centers of energy in the county? You know, like if it's Elkton and Bergton where they have the flooding, then we can connect around that issue. If it's another place, then we can maybe connect on something else. But I just think finding a substantive problem, and maybe it's the jail. Maybe it's really resisting this thing. We do not have a progressive prosecutor in our area. Our Commonwealth's attorney is not one of the progressive prosecutors, but in Charlottesville, they elected a progressive Commonwealth's attorney. And we're working there on a restorative justice diversion project. Possibly we could get some change here. They did put some restorative justice in for youth, right, for juvenile, but they're not doing it for anything else. So just keep working away.
So the thing that just strikes me as so interesting is you started this story by explaining that the county and the city are really wide apart and they vote totally differently and they're very much at odds. And then the similarities just seem massive. And there's no recognition of that and nobody besides you trying to do anything about that, I gather.
Well, it's interesting because when I met with the militia, I said, you know, those are problems that we're talking about in the city too, right? I mean, these are all shared problems. And some of them are younger and they go, yes. But there's also this really interesting mental model of the way people divide the geographic space. So stretching it a little further, I was doing some work in Shenandoah County, which is the next county north, on a river protection project. This was more than a decade ago now. And the river that they're trying to protect, the North Fork of the Shenandoah River, actually originates in Rockingham County, right? But they called us in and asked us to help them with how do we sustain our group? We're aging, we don't have many young members, this sort of thing. And I was like, well, have you thought about kind of expanding into Rockingham County? We're a Shenandoah County organization. I'm like, yeah, but the river starts in Rockingham County. And then I started hearing these narratives of, well, Rockingham County, they're all kind of snooty, uppity, rich bankers and farmers. And this is Shenandoah County. And then I realized, I kept digging into this. I'm going, what is going on? We're right here, right? Like I lived right near the border of those counties. I'm like, what is going on? Turns out there's a microclimate difference. Rockingham County, as I said, was really rich, high rainfall, all that. But because of the mountains, Shenandoah County is much more arid, and the farmers up there are poorer. And this kind of reputation of Shenandoah County, Rockingham County, most of the people on that board were come-heres. They didn't even grow up with that mental boundary in their head, but somehow had caught it, right? And so when I say that, I'm in these meetings and somebody goes, oh, that's why the people in Linville, now Linville is 5 miles north of the city line. Oh, that's why the people in Linville don't go to Harrisonburg to shop. They go to Timberville, which is further away. Right? I'm like, interesting. Or they'll go to Broadway, which used to be halfway. But Broadway has now lost all of its locally owned grocery stores. So you have to go to Timberville to get to the Walmart to get your groceries. But they don't think to come into Harrisonburg to do their grocery shopping.
Wow.
What's the media look like? These are a lot of interesting local stories, and if your neighborhood's anything like ours, the local newspapers have been pretty much wiped out with all sorts of trends, and it's hard to even. I used to get involved in local politics around here, and you'd get a story in the paper and it'd generate a lot of interesting interactions. and the papers aren't there anymore. The news
Right.
people pay attention to is national syndicated us versus them red blue stuff. And if you could
Well,
ever start
yeah.
seeing the local stories, then a lot of these opportunities, I think, get open up again.
I think so. So it's an interesting media scenario here. We were not ever really in a lot of good shape around media for the newspaper. It was the newspapers up and down the whole valley were owned by the Byrd family, and they were very conservative, BYRD, Byrd family. And they just sold out. Now that's what's interesting is they sold out, and I can't remember which group it is. I would have to look it up, but they're located in West Virginia. And now I've seen more diversity of the viewpoints published than it used to be under the Byrds. I thought it was going to get more conservative, but it's actually gotten a little more diverse. And there is an actual paper 6 days a week. It's hanging in there. I mean, I keep a subscription at the office, and somebody said, "Why are you doing that?" We read it online. I said, because we need a local newspaper, and we can afford $187 for the year to keep a local newspaper, right? But we also have an online newspaper that's very competitive, and our local NPR station has started doing local news stories. There's a really dynamic guy there who's mentoring a lot of young reporters who then get scooped out and go off and do other things, but into doing local news out of our NPR station. I don't know how much people in the county listen to NPR in general, right? There's also an AM talk radio that's pretty much the rough kind of stuff, right? Like, yeah. But yeah, and then there's a local television station. So, yeah. I think so. I mean, I do. I think there's a lot we could do, and I think we could model something. I would love to see us be able to do. So you asked what I'm going to kind of do if I think after I retire. Something along this. I've been playing around with what's my next kind of mission, vision in life. Thought about running for public office because I've been asked. And I've concluded that's not where my, I mean, at 66 or 67, I'm not going to start a political career. I know how exhausting that is. But I think what I really want to do is focus on supporting any kinds of activities that support us in renegotiating our social contract as a country. I think we have to face the reality that the social contract on which our aspirational documents were founded and even woven into those aspirational documents is a deeply flawed social contract that includes domination, extraction of wealth, and abuse of low power people, right? And racism. It's all built in there. And we have to go back and redo that if we're going to grow into the aspirations that we founded our country on. You can't carry both of them forward.
Well, it's certainly hard to go forward if you don't have an image of where you're going forward to.
Right. Or if all of these patterns of thought that are deeply invisible are not actually taken out and re-examined, right? Kind of myths of meritocracy and, all kinds of patterns of thinking that are just not going to get us there.
So how do we get out of those?
I think the first thing is you have to call them out and name them. You have to trace their history. You have to acknowledge, I think we could probably, all of us could tell stories. How did my family come in here as immigrants and then move to the middle class the way we did? We're Italian. We did it by becoming white. Sorry. Right? Italians weren't white when we got here. we constructed a narrative of whiteness around Christopher Columbus, which is why everybody wants to protect the Christopher Columbus statues. But there's not a conversation about, well, why did you elevate him like that? Because it was a process of cultural whitening, and kind of validating and legitimating our right to be here. We all have to start telling these stories, right?
Yeah, I think we need to tell the stories of parts of our history that were good and people were going the right direction. Something to balance acknowledging the many, many problems as well. But if we lose track of the good things we did together, we're not left with much other than the bad things.
Yeah, no, I agree. So in addition to not talking about Tulsa, we also didn't talk about and don't talk about the incredible progressive union movement in Appalachia. And, you know, we have this whole narrative in the country about Appalachia as this benighted place. I'm sorry, but even today, all across the South and in the in the Appalachian region, there are progressive groups that have been working for centuries, decades on really progressive movements. They are, I loved a sign I saw earlier on Facebook. They're being held hostage by hostile state actors, right? By the gerrymandering, but there's a lot of work going on in rural communities that people are not seeing and not talking about. And we need to pull that history up as well, right?
And clearly, as you said, even militias who liberals like us tend to think of as being dangerous and evil and hateful, sounds like they're doing a lot of things that we would approve of.
I would easily work alongside those guys on a project, right? Like I was like, yeah, let's do it. And even some of the folks who are a little bit more on the Second Amendment guns thing, right? If you could set that aside for a minute while we work on this flooding problem, I'm happy to work alongside you. I think the white supremacist organizations that are actually trying to foment hate, that's a different story. But it's really important that we have a much more subtle understanding of who the actors are, right? Yeah. And then this Robert Pate research around the fact that, you know, over half of the people that have got charges against them out of January 6th were not poor, were not members of militia groups, were not any of that. They were white people from counties that voted blue who have bought into and some of them own businesses. They weren't like people who weren't successful, but who have bought into the white replacement theory, right? And so let's talk about why that feels so scary to people. I mean, it's an implicit recognition that being white is a privilege, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are things that folks on the left do that sort of reinforce that narrative. There are all of these stories about, if we could just get a few more people, few more immigrants, a few more people of this group, and then the whites would never win an election again.
Right.
And well, there's a book, the Coming Democratic Majority or something, that makes that argument.
Well, there's another one that was called The End of Whiteness.
And, you know, if you want to try to make people anxious and paranoid, that's a good way to do it.
Well, I mean, there's a demographic reality. We're going to become a majority minority country, right? It's coming and it's going to happen. And I think the question is, why would we be afraid of that? We would only be afraid of that if we're a country where the rules of the game are one group dominates the other. If we were a country where we all lived together and worked cooperatively for a shared future and for the good of our children, then we wouldn't be afraid of that. So, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wish I'd done more, but, you know, this kind of relational building takes a little time. You can't keep hounding people.
Well, we could come back and do this again in a year and see where things have gone.
We'll see.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
thank you very much. I know that it's been a busy day for you and sounds like busy summer. And we really appreciate this.
Thank you. It's always good to chat with you all.